Kiravel stood at the top of the Harmony Spire, watching the stars like she had done every single day for 4 long years. Her body looked like it was made of beautiful crystal that glowed with soft light, but now that glow was getting weaker. Where her skin used to be smooth and shiny like a perfect mirror, there were now cracks running through it like broken glass. These weren't just regular cracks. They pulsed with a tired, dim light that showed just how exhausted she really was. The other Silmarin people were lucky. They only needed to sit quietly and meditate for a few minutes each day to feel completely refreshed. It was like taking a short nap, but for them, those few minutes were enough to keep going for days. But Kiravel couldn't do that anymore. She couldn't take even the shortest break, because something terrible was always watching, always waiting. The shadow wraiths were the reason she couldn't sleep. These creatures weren't like anything you could see or touch. They lived between dimensions, in the empty spaces between reality. Think of reality like a big piece of cloth, and these creatures lived in the tiny holes between the threads. They were smart and patient, like hunters who could wait forever for the perfect moment to strike. Every time Kiravel had tried to rest over the past 4 years, even for just a few seconds, she could feel reality starting to tear apart. It was like the fabric of space itself was getting thin, and the shadow wraiths were trying to push their way through. She was the only one who could sense them coming. The other guardians of her city took turns watching different areas, but none of them had her special ability to feel when the creatures were getting close. Her people didn't understand why she never rested. They would whisper about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Some said she was going crazy from staying awake too long. Others worried that she was becoming weak and brittle, like a piece of crystal that might shatter if you touched it wrong. But Kiravel knew something they didn't know. She could feel the shadow wraiths moving around in the space between dimensions, always looking for a way to break through into their world. The Harmony Spire was the most important building in their entire city. It was like a lighthouse that kept their world safe, and if something happened to it, their whole civilization could be destroyed. That's why Kiravel couldn't take any chances. Every night when the other guardians went to rest, she stayed awake. Every morning when they returned to their duties, she was still there, still watching. Then one day something unexpected happened. A ship appeared in their sky, but it wasn't one of their own ships. The energy coming from it felt chaotic and wild, completely different from the calm, ordered energy of her people. It was a human ship called the Peaceful Dawn, and they were asking for permission to land because they had some kind of emergency. Kiravel stared at the ship through her tired eyes. She had heard stories about humans, but had never met one. Their energy felt dangerous and unpredictable, like a storm that could break everything it touched. Her first thought was to tell them no, to send them away before they could disturb the careful balance she had been protecting for so long. But something made her hesitate. Dr. Hana Kim stepped off the Peaceful Dawn and immediately felt something was wrong. As the ship's specialist in understanding alien minds and emotions, she had trained for years to pick up on the feelings of different species, but what she sensed from the crystal being in front of her hit her like a wave of pure exhaustion. Hana watched as Kiravel moved toward them for the official greeting. Every step the Silmaran took was perfect and controlled, but there was something scary about how rigid she looked. It reminded Hana of watching someone walk on ice, technically correct, but one wrong move, and everything would shatter. Kiravel's crystal skin was supposed to glow with healthy light, but instead it looked dim and cracked, like a phone screen that had been dropped too many times. The welcoming ceremony took place in a beautiful circular room with walls that seemed to sing with soft music. The other Silmaran moved gracefully, their crystal bodies chiming like gentle bells as they walked, but Kiravel stood apart from them, rigid as a statue. Hana could feel the exhaustion pouring off her like heat from a fever. It was so strong that it made Hana's own head start to ache. During her training on Earth, Hana had learned that humans were unusual in the galaxy because their emotions were so chaotic and powerful. Most alien species found human feelings overwhelming, like trying to listen to 100 different songs playing at the same time. But Hana had discovered that sometimes this chaos could be helpful. If she focused her mind in the right way, she could project calm feelings outward, like a radio broadcasting peaceful thoughts. She decided to try something that might help. Moving closer to Kiravel during the ceremony, Hana closed her eyes and started thinking about the most peaceful places she knew back on Earth. She remembered walking through the quiet temples in Seoul early in the morning when the air was cool and the only sounds were birds singing and distant temple bells. She thought about hiking in the mountains near her childhood home, watching the morning mist rise from the valleys like soft white blankets. The effect was incredible. Almost immediately, Hana saw the cracks in Kiravel's crystal skin stop pulsing, so frantically. The dim light inside her began to glow a little brighter, and her shoulders, which had been held so tightly they looked painful, finally started to relax. It was like watching someone who had been holding their breath for years, finally allowing themselves to breathe. The other Silmaran in the room noticed the change too. They started whispering to each other in their musical language, pointing at Kiravel with surprise. Some of them hadn't seen their primary guardian look this relaxed in years. A few of the younger ones had never seen her without those stress cracks running through her skin. Hana kept projecting those peaceful thoughts, adding new memories as they came to her. She thought about sitting by quiet lakes, watching rain fall on her apartment window, and the feeling of safety she used to have as a child when her grandmother would hum old songs while cooking dinner. Each peaceful memory seemed to make Kiravel's light grow a little stronger. For the first time in 4 years, something that felt like peace flickered around Kiravel's crystal form. It was faint and fragile, like the first warm day after a long winter, but it was real. The defensive energy field that always surrounded her, sharp and warning like invisible thorns, softened into something that almost felt welcoming. The peaceful dawn needed several days to fix their damaged engines, which gave Hana the perfect excuse to stay close to the Silmaran city. She quickly volunteered to be the cultural liaison, the person responsible for helping humans and aliens understand each other better. It was the kind of job she loved, but this time she had a secret reason. She wanted to help Kiravel, and she couldn't do that from inside a spaceship. Every day Hana would walk with Kiravel around the city, learning how the Silmaran lived. The crystal people didn't talk with words like humans did. Instead, they made beautiful musical sounds that could carry complex meanings. It was like having a conversation entirely in song. Hana had studied this kind of communication before, but hearing it in person was amazing. When Kiravel was relaxed, enough to speak normally, her voice sounded like wind chimes dancing in a gentle breeze. Slowly, through patient listening and careful questions, Hana began to understand the terrible truth about what Kiravel was protecting everyone from. The shadow wraiths weren't just scary monsters from another dimension. They were like invisible vampires that fed on the life energy of thinking beings. They existed in the spaces between realities, always hungry, always looking for a way to break through into worlds full of living minds they could drain. The scariest part was how they hunted. These creatures were incredibly patient and smart. They would hover just outside reality, feeling around for weak spots like cracks in a wall. The only time they could push through was when the people guarding those weak spots let their mental defenses down even for a second. It was like having to keep a door locked every moment of every day, knowing that the instant you stopped paying attention, something horrible would break in. Kiravel explained that she wasn't like the other guardians. While they could sense danger when it was close, she could feel the shadow wraiths moving around in the space between dimensions, even when they were far away. It was like being the only person in a group who could hear wolves howling in the distance, while everyone else only noticed them when they were already at the door. The other Silmaran had no idea how special Kiravel's abilities were. They had set up a schedule where different guardians would take turns watching for danger, thinking this was perfectly safe. They would work for a few hours, then go rest while someone else took over. But they didn't know that during their rest times, Kiravel was still secretly keeping watch, because she was the only one who could sense when the shadow wraiths were trying to find ways through. Hana felt horrible when she realized what this meant. Kiravel had been carrying the weight of protecting her entire world all by herself for 4 years, and no one even knew she was doing it. It was like being the only lifeguard at a beach where everyone else thought there were plenty of lifeguards on duty. "What if we shared the watching?" Hana suggested one day as they walked past the Harmony Spire. Maybe I could help somehow. Kiravel's crystal form flickered with what looked like sadness. Your people cannot sense the wraiths, she sang in her musical voice. You would not know when they approach. But then something interesting happened. As they stood there talking, Kiravel suddenly stopped and tilted her head, like she was listening to something Hana couldn't hear. Her eyes widened with surprise. Strange, Kiravel whispered. The barriers feel stronger when you are near. Hana's mind was racing with possibilities as she thought about what Kiravel had just told her. The barriers between dimensions felt stronger when a human was nearby. That didn't make sense at first, but then she remembered something from her studies about how different species evolved. Kiravel, she said excitedly, your people evolved on a world where everything was ordered and peaceful, right? Your thoughts are like beautiful music, organized and harmonious. The Crystal Guardian nodded, her form chiming softly. Yes, we find chaos disturbing. But humans are the opposite, Hana continued. We evolved on a crazy planet where everything was unpredictable. Earthquakes, storms, predators, ice ages. Our brains had to learn to handle constant change and disorder. Maybe that's exactly what confuses the shadow wraiths. She began pacing excitedly, her human energy making Kiravel's light flicker with curiosity instead of exhaustion for once. Think about it like this. The shadow wraiths are used to moving through dimensions by following organized thought patterns, like following a clear path. But human minds don't work that way. We're always thinking about 10 different things at once. Maybe our chaotic thoughts are like static on a radio that makes it impossible for them to find their way. Kiravel listened carefully, but Hana could see the doubt in her dimming light. Even if this is true, she sang sadly, you cannot sense the wraiths approaching. How could you guard against something you cannot detect? That's where the experiment comes in, Hana said, sitting down beside the exhausted guardian. What if I don't need to detect them? What if my job isn't to watch for them, but to make it impossible for them to navigate in the first place? Like being a lighthouse that creates interference instead of guidance. She took Kiravel's crystal hand gently. It felt cool and smooth, but she could feel the tiny vibrations of stress running through it. You're falling apart, Kiravel. I can see it, and I know you can feel it. Those cracks in your skin are getting deeper every day. What happens to your people if you collapse completely? The question hung in the air like a weight. They both knew the answer. If Kiravel's abilities failed, the shadow wraiths would break through and an entire civilization would be destroyed. One test, Hana said softly. Just one rest cycle. I'll sit with you and keep my mind as chaotic and unpredictable as possible. If the barriers weaken, you can wake up immediately. But if I'm right, if human consciousness really does interfere with their navigation, then maybe you can finally get the rest you desperately need. Kiravel was quiet for a long time, her internal light flickering as she considered the proposal. Finally, she nodded weakly. I am so tired, Hana. I fear I will fail my people soon anyway. They went to the most sacred place in the entire Silmaran city, the heart of the Harmony Spire. It was a circular room with walls that seemed to be made of living crystal, humming with gentle energy. In the center was a platform that looked like it was grown rather than built, perfectly shaped. To cradle a Silmaran body, Kiravel lay down on the resonance platform, and for the first time in 4 years, she closed her eyes. Hana sat cross-legged nearby and began to let her mind wander freely. She thought about her favorite song from childhood, then suddenly remembered the taste of her grandmother's soup, which led to thinking about the funny way her cat used to chase shadows, which reminded her of a movie she'd seen last week. The beautiful chaos of human thought filled the sacred chamber. As Kiravel's eyes closed, something magical began to happen. For the first time in 4 long years, her crystal body started to relax completely. The constant tension that had been holding her together like invisible strings finally began to loosen. Her breathing, which had been shallow and quick from endless stress, slowly deepened into the peaceful rhythm of true rest. Hana sat nearby, letting her mind bounce from thought to thought like a rubber ball in a room full of obstacles. One moment she was remembering the sound of rain on her bedroom window back on Earth. The next, she was thinking about a funny joke her friend told her last week, Then suddenly she was humming a random song she'd heard on the radio years ago. Her thoughts jumped from memories of eating spicy noodles in Seoul to wondering what her pet goldfish was doing back home, to calculating how many stars she could see through the crystal ceiling. The effect on the dimensional barriers was immediate and incredible. Where Kiravel's ordered, musical thoughts had created clear pathways that the shadow wraiths could follow like roads. Hana's chaotic mind was like a maze that kept changing every second. The creatures from between dimensions, who had been circling, like sharks for years, suddenly found themselves completely lost. It was like trying to navigate through a city where all the street signs kept changing and the roads moved around randomly. Meanwhile, Kiravel's body began to heal itself in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The stress fractures that had been spreading through her crystal skin like cracks in ice started to close up, sealing themselves with new, healthy crystal growth. The dim, exhausted light that had been flickering inside her began to grow brighter and stronger, like a dying candle suddenly given fresh wax. Her psychic abilities, which had been stretched thin from overuse, actually started getting stronger, instead of weaker. It was like a muscle that had been cramped for years finally being allowed to relax and recover. The part of her mind that could sense the shadow wraiths became sharper and clearer, but without the desperate edge of panic that had defined it for so long. Outside the sacred chamber, the other Silmaran began to notice something was different. The dimensional monitoring equipment that had been showing dangerous fluctuations for years suddenly displayed the most stable readings anyone had ever seen. The barriers between dimensions weren't just holding steady, they were actually getting stronger. Some of the older Silmaran, who remembered what peace felt like before the Shadow Wraith threat began, started to sense that familiar feeling of safety returning to their world. The Shadow Wraiths themselves were experiencing something they had never encountered before. These creatures, who had spent centuries learning to navigate the spaces between realities, found themselves stumbling around like blind animals in a storm. Hana's human consciousness created patterns that made no sense to them. Just when they thought they understood the direction of her thoughts, she would suddenly think about something completely different, sending them spinning in the wrong direction. Hours passed peacefully. Hana's mind continued its beautiful, chaotic dance, while Kiravel's body worked to repair 4 years of damage. The Crystal Guardian's skin grew smoother and more radiant with each passing hour. The musical hum that was her natural voice, which had been reduced to barely a whisper from exhaustion, gradually returned to its full, rich tone. When Kiravel finally opened her eyes after 12 hours of deep healing sleep, she felt like she was seeing the world clearly for the first time in years. The constant fog of exhaustion that had clouded her thoughts was completely gone. Her body felt strong and flexible instead of brittle and fragile. Most importantly, she could sense that the dimensional barriers were not just intact, they were stronger than they had been in decades. The morning after Kiravel's first real sleep in 4 years, alarms started going off all over the Silmaran city. But these weren't danger alarms. They were the kind of alerts that meant something incredibly good had happened. The dimensional monitoring stations, which had been showing yellow and red warning lights for years, were now glowing with steady green signals that no one had seen in decades. Elder Zilnara, the head of the Silmaran Council, rushed to the main monitoring center with her flowing crystal robes chiming like bells with each hurried step. When she saw the readings on the screens, she had to sit down in shock. The dimensional barriers weren't just stable, they were stronger than anything in their recorded history. The Shadow Wraiths, who had been a constant threat lurking just outside reality, seemed to have completely disappeared from their senses. "This is impossible," whispered Council Member Veltos, his crystal form flickering with confusion. "Our barriers have never been this strong, not even before the Wraiths first appeared." But when they called Kiravel to the council chamber, the proof was standing right in front of them. Their primary guardian, who had looked like she might shatter at any moment just yesterday, now glowed with healthy light. The stress cracks that had covered her crystal skin were completely gone, and she moved with a grace and strength they hadn't seen from her in years. "Tell us exactly what happened," Elder Zilnara requested, her musical voice filled with amazement. Kiravel explained everything, how Hana's chaotic human thoughts had created interference that confused the shadow wraiths, how the dimensional barriers had actually grown stronger while she slept, and how her own abilities had been restored instead of weakened by the rest. The council members looked at each other with expressions of wonder and disbelief. For years they had believed that constant vigilance was the only way to protect their world. The idea that chaos could create stability went against everything they understood about how the universe worked. "We must study this phenomenon immediately," declared Elder Zilnara. "If this human technique can truly protect us, we need to understand it completely." They formally asked Hana to extend her stay on their world, offering her access to their most advanced research facilities and the chance to work with their greatest scientists. For Hana, it was like being offered the opportunity of a lifetime. She had always dreamed of making a real difference in interspecies relations, and this could change how different civilizations protected themselves throughout the galaxy. "I'll need to contact my people," Hana told the council. "There are other humans who might be able to help with this research." Within days, 2 more humans arrived on special transport ships. June Park was a communications specialist who had spent years studying how different species' minds processed information. His thoughts tended to follow complex patterns, jumping between languages and communication methods in ways that created even more confusing interference for the shadow wraiths. Min Lee was a cultural anthropologist who loved understanding how different societies worked. Her mind was always analyzing and comparing different ways of thinking, creating a constantly shifting landscape of thoughts that was like a maze within a maze for any creature trying to navigate through human consciousness. Each human brought their own unique way of thinking to the experiment. June's mind would switch between Korean, English, and several alien languages he had learned, while also thinking about sound patterns, body language, and communication theory all at the same time. Min's thoughts would dart between comparing Silmaran culture to Earth cultures, wondering about the historical development of their society, and analyzing the social implications of their discovery. The result was even more amazing than anyone had hoped. With 3 human minds creating interference instead of just one, the dimensional barriers became so stable that the monitoring equipment had to be recalibrated to measure the new levels of protection. Over the next few weeks, more humans began arriving on the Silmaran homeworld, each one bringing their own special way of thinking that added to the protective chaos. The peaceful dawn had sent out calls across human space, looking for volunteers with specific mental abilities that might help strengthen the dimensional barriers even more. Day arrived first, a musician from Earth who spent his days composing songs that blended different musical styles from around the galaxy. His mind was constantly humming with melodies, rhythm patterns, and strange combinations of instruments that shouldn't work together but somehow did. When he sat in meditation near the Harmony Spire, his thoughts created a kind of musical static that made the shadow wraiths feel like they were trying to navigate through a symphony where all the instruments were playing different songs at the same time. Then came Yuki, a professional chef who had spent years learning to cook food for dozens of different alien species. Her mind was always thinking about flavors, textures, temperatures, and chemical reactions. She would remember the exact taste of a spice from one planet while calculating cooking times for a completely different type of food, all while wondering how to adapt a human recipe for beings who didn't even eat the same types of molecules. Her chaotic, food-focused thoughts created interference patterns that smelled and tasted different to the shadow wraiths, confusing their senses in ways they had never experienced. The humans quickly figured out that they worked best when they created a schedule, just like the Silmaran Guardians used to do, but with a twist. Instead of one person being on duty at a time, they would work in pairs with their combined chaos, creating even stronger interference. Hana would work with June, their thoughts bouncing off each other and creating patterns that were twice as confusing as either could manage alone. June's linguistic mind was particularly fascinating to watch. He would start thinking in Korean, then switch to English mid-thought, then suddenly remember a conversation he'd had in the clicking language of the Cathari species, all while mentally composing a message in the mathematical symbols used by the crystal beings of Proxima 7. His brain treated language like a living, changing thing, and the shadow wraiths, who were used to the precise musical communication of the Silmaran, found his mental chatter completely impossible to follow. Min's analytical mind worked differently but was equally effective. She would start analyzing the social structure of Silmaran society, then suddenly compare it to ancient Earth civilizations, then wonder how both compared to the hive mind species she'd studied last year. Her thoughts were like a constantly running research project that never reached a conclusion, because she was always finding new connections and possibilities to explore. The shadow wraiths, who had been hunting in this region of space for centuries, had never encountered anything like human consciousness before. They were used to the ordered, predictable thought patterns of most intelligent species. The Silmaran thought in harmony, the Velthari thought in precise geometric patterns, and the Zephyrians thought in mathematical equations. All of these could be followed and understood, like reading a map. But human thoughts were like trying to read a map that was constantly rewriting itself in different languages while someone was shaking it during an earthquake. Every time the shadow wraiths thought they understood the pattern, the humans would think about something completely different, sending the creatures spinning off in the wrong direction. After a month of this constant confusion, something remarkable happened. The shadow wraiths simply stopped trying to break through in the areas protected by human consciousness. These ancient predators, who had never retreated from a hunting ground before, began to avoid the Silmaran homeworld entirely. The amazing success of the human-Silmaran partnership changed everything about how the Crystal People thought about protecting their world. For thousands of years, they had believed that the strongest guardian was one who could stand alone, enduring endless hours of solitary watch without breaking. But now, they were discovering that two minds working together could be far more powerful than one mind working alone. Kiravel, now fully restored and stronger than she had ever been, became the teacher for a completely new way of doing things. She started training other Silmaran guardians to work with human partners, showing them how to blend their ordered musical thoughts with the beautiful chaos of human consciousness. It wasn't easy at first. Many of the Silmaran found human thinking patterns overwhelming and confusing. It's like trying to sing a perfect song while someone plays 10 different radio stations at the same time, complained Velnara, a young guardian who was struggling to work with her human partner. But Kiravel taught them to think about it differently. Don't try to control the chaos, she would sing in her gentle, chiming voice. Let it flow around your thoughts like a river flows around stones. Your ordered mind becomes the anchor, while their chaotic mind becomes the storm that protects us. The humans, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons. Hana discovered that she could make her mental interference even more effective by focusing her random thoughts in certain directions. Instead of just letting her mind wander anywhere, she learned to guide her chaos toward thoughts that created the most confusion for the shadow wraiths. June found that switching between languages was most effective when he did it in the middle of complex ideas, breaking up concepts that the wraiths might otherwise follow. He would start explaining quantum physics in Korean, switch to English for the mathematical parts, then finish the thought in the musical tones he had learned from the Silmaran themselves. Min developed what she called analytical spirals, thoughts that would start with one question and branch out into dozens of related questions, creating a maze of curiosity that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. She would wonder about Silmaran architecture, which would make her think about human architecture, which would lead to thoughts about how buildings reflected culture, which would spiral into questions about how culture influenced art, and so on until even she wasn't sure where her thoughts had taken her. The most exciting discovery came when they realized that the human Silmaran teams were becoming stronger than anyone had expected. The Silmaran partners weren't just getting better. Their psychic abilities were actually improving from working with humans. It was like their ordered minds were being sharpened by contact with chaotic ones, creating new neural pathways they had never developed before. Young Silmaran, who trained with human partners from the beginning, showed abilities that amazed the elders. They could sense dimensional disturbances from greater distances, detect threats that older guardians missed, and maintain their psychic focus for longer periods without fatigue. The humans were changing too, developing better control over their natural mental chaos and learning to sense things they had never noticed before. What had started as a desperate experiment to help one exhausted guardian get some sleep had turned into a complete revolution in how two different species could work together. Scientists from across the galaxy started arriving to study this new form of cooperation, amazed that chaos and order could strengthen each other instead of cancelling each other out. The Silmaran Council officially changed their defense protocols, making human-Silmaran partnerships the standard for all guardian duties. They built new training facilities where young people from both species could learn to work together from the beginning, creating bonds that made them incredibly effective teams. 6 months had passed since that first desperate experiment in the sacred chamber of the Harmony Spire, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Caravel stood at her familiar post atop the great crystal tower, but everything about her was different now. Her skin glowed with the healthy, vibrant light that had been missing for so many years. Where deep stress fractures had once threatened to shatter her crystal form, there was now smooth, flawless surface that sparkled like polished diamonds in the light of their twin suns. Beside her, Hana sat in comfortable meditation, her human mind creating its now familiar patterns of beautiful chaos. After months of practice, she had learned to guide her thoughts in ways that created the most effective interference against the shadow wraiths. Right now, she was remembering a rainy afternoon from her childhood, when she had tried to bake cookies with her sister, but her mind kept jumping to wondering what rain would feel like on this crystal world. Then to thoughts about how different species experienced weather, then to a funny memory about getting caught in a thunderstorm during a camping trip. The partnership between them had become so natural that they barely needed to speak anymore. Caravel could sense when Hana was getting tired and needed to switch mental topics to stay sharp. Hana could feel when Caravel detected something unusual in the dimensional barriers and would automatically intensify her chaotic thinking to provide extra protection. The Harmony Spire itself seemed to respond to their combined presence. The crystal walls hummed with a peaceful energy that resonated throughout the entire city. Citizens would often comment that they slept better at night, knowing that their guardians were working together up in the tower. Children would point up at the spire and tell stories about the human and Silmaran, who had learned to share their thoughts to keep everyone safe. The shadow wraiths had become nothing more than an unpleasant memory. The creatures had tried for weeks to find new ways through the dimensional barriers, but human consciousness proved to be an obstacle they simply couldn't overcome. Eventually, they had moved on to hunt in other regions of space, leaving the Silmaran homeworld in peace for the first time in decades. Other Silmaran worlds had begun requesting human partners for their own guardians. The partnership program had expanded across their entire civilization, creating bonds between the two species that went far beyond just protection. Young Silmaran and humans were growing up together, learning each other's languages and ways of thinking, creating friendships that would last lifetimes. Caravel often thought about how wrong she had been during those 4 terrible years of isolation. She had believed that the only way to protect the people she loved was to carry the burden entirely by herself, never resting, never trusting anyone else to share the responsibility. The weight of that loneliness had nearly destroyed her, and it certainly hadn't made her people any safer. Now she understood that true strength wasn't about enduring suffering alone. It was about finding the right person to stand beside you, someone whose weaknesses complemented your strengths and whose strengths covered your weaknesses. Hana's chaotic human mind provided protection in ways that Caravel's ordered thoughts never could, while Caravel's precise psychic abilities gave Hana's chaos direction and purpose. As the day turned to evening and their shift prepared to end, Caravel looked out over her crystal city with genuine peace in her heart. Tomorrow, another human Silmaran team would take their place, continuing the protection while they rested. And when Caravel returned to duty, she would do so refreshed and strong, ready to face whatever challenges might come. The darkness was still out there, somewhere in the spaces between realities, but it no longer felt overwhelming or impossible to defeat. With the right partner beside her, Caravel had learned that even the deepest darkness could be held back by two minds sharing the light.